Well, good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you all to our virtual panel discussion on what is a rapidly evolving situation in and with Iran, co-hosted by the Institute of Politics and the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard. In the midst of roiling protests, a brutal regime crackdown, heightened regional tensions, and significant implications for U.S. regional and global security, this conversation aims to provide clarity and context on what is unfolding in Iran and what it may mean moving forward. And we're really fortunate today to be joined by a distinguished panel with deep policy, diplomatic, and regional expertise. First, we have Phil Gordon. Phil is a Sidney Stein Junior Scholar at the Brookings Institution, and he's the former National Security Advisor to Vice President Kamala Harris. And he was a former top Middle East official at the National Security Council who brings firsthand experience shaping U.S. policy towards Iran and the broader region. We also have my fellow Harvard Kennedy School colleague Lina Khatib. She is currently a visiting scholar at the Belfer Center Middle East Initiative and brings critical insight into Iran's internal dynamics and regional influence as well. We also have Mike Singh. Mike is the managing director and Lane Swig Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, who adds a strategic perspective on U.S. foreign policy and Middle East security more broadly. And we're also fortunate to have Holly Dagres, the Levitsky Family Senior Fellow in the Washington Institute's Viterbi program on Iran and U.S. policy, who brings deep expertise on Iranian society, politics, and U.S.-Iran relations. I'm Ned Price. I'm the co-director of the Institute of Politics, and I am pleased to moderate today's discussion. I look forward to what I know will be a thoughtful and substantive conversation with our panelists. Just in terms of the run of show today, I'll start with a few questions of my own for the panelists before then turning to audience Q&A. I'll remind the audience to pose questions in the chat box using the Q&A function that you see at the bottom of your Zoom screen after our initial discussion, but you're welcome to start sharing your questions as the conversation begins in just a moment. Just a reminder, this conversation is being recorded for YouTube and it's going to be live streamed as well. I'd ask the questioners if they're comfortable to identify themselves when drafting their questions, stating their Harvard affiliation and their year if they wish. But if you do wish to pose a question anonymously, that's okay too. So with that, let's get started with an initial conversation, and then we'll turn to Q&A. And Holly, I'd really like to start with you, as you have what I think is an excellent beat on what's happening on the ground, what has happened on the ground, what Iranians are saying on social media to the extent they've been able to access this in recent weeks. So I'm curious if you can help us sort through some of the noise to better understand how the protests have evolved into, what has become this mass movement, and crucially, how the regime has responded. And I'm also curious to hear you expound on a point you made in a recent New York Times piece, where you noted that Iran's Gen Z has tended to display far less patience for the regime. And I'd be curious to hear your take on the generational implications of what we're seeing unfolding in Iran today.
Thank you, Ned, and thank you to Harvard for having me today to talk about this important issue. Well, right now we're week 3 of the anti-regime protests in Iran. We're not exactly sure if they're ongoing because there's been a communication shutdown since January 8th. And it wasn't until January 13th that landlines were turned on for one-way calls from Iran. And whatever we're seeing is from illegal or smuggled Starlink terminals, which there are reported 50 to 60,000 users inside the country. An Iranian official actually said that they might not turn on the internet till Nowruz, or the Iranian New Year, which is in mid-March. Before the images of the massacre petered out via Starlink, and I should probably note about the numbers for a second, the group Human Rights Activists in Iran has documented 2,500 killed and over 22,000 arrested. But there's credible documentation that says that number is actually around 12,000, with CBS reporting that it could be as high as 20,000. Before this communications shutdown, there were, I would say, extraordinary bravery caught on video and photos of Iranians, and bravery we've seen from them time and time again over the years. On October 29th, there was this one Iranian man whose head was covered, and he sat on the ground with his jacket pulled over as security forces faced him. And this visual went viral amongst Iranians. They compared it to tank men in Tiananmen Square in China. But what many people didn't see in the West, but what I saw on social media and posted on my own social media accounts, were that Iranians were trying to show solidarity with the protests, not just by taking a street, but online. They were using a song called Preparation for War, which was written for the Iran-Iraq War. And that was starting to pop up on Iranians' ordinary photos, ordinary posts. Some were using it as subtle acts of protest. My favorite that I shared on Twitter was of this, and I would say non-alcoholic bartender standing in Freedom Square doing tricks with bottles, and it said, "Party on you, drinks on us," basically insinuating that the regime would fall and they would be free. While these protests started in the bazaars, and because it was triggered by the collapse of the Iranian rial, it seemingly has been led by Iranian Gen Z. So these are youth between the ages of 14 and 29 years old. And what really makes them unique as a whole is that they're part of a truly globalized generation. So they were the first to be born with social media and internet at their fingertips. And just to like do some compare and contrast with Gen Zs in the West, they have the same style. They listen to Taylor Swift and K-pop. They watch bootleg Stranger Things and Rick and Morty and have English slang woven into Persian. And of course, Iranian Gen Z, like youth everywhere, have the same needs and wants. And so Gen Z actually led Women Life Freedom. And that was the uprising that was unsuccessful in its quest for positive change, which was, again, it was triggered by systemic mismanagement, corruption, and repression, and an explicit call for the ouster of the Islamic Republic. But Women Life Freedom has since turned into a movement. They were also arguably the first of Gen Z to lead this global Gen Z protest trend we've seen around the globe in recent months in Nepal, the Philippines, and Madagascar. I would say it started in Iran in 2022. If you watched Iran in recent months, you might have noticed that most Iranian and women and girls are not wearing hijab. I would say this isn't reform. It's because they push back against authority and have strength in numbers. You might have also seen a viral video of kids jamming on a Tehran street to Seven Nation Army by White Stripes. Unfortunately, the band was arrested. But I would say this is generational rupture, and it's because this youth won't bow down to the Islamic Republic. And it's for this reason that they were and are still on the streets. They're fully aware that they'll be met with bullets and batons, all in the pursuit of something very profoundly simple. And that's a normal life that everybody else they seem to see have except them. So thank you.
Thanks, Holly. Phil, Holly has painted a pretty vivid picture of the Iranian street in recent weeks. And obviously, you have seen this from various vantage points, including going back to 2000, 2009, other protest movements. Let's assume this were a very different world, and you were advising, President Kamala Harris on the U.S. response. I'm curious, what are the options that you think are available to the United States? And then, if you want to offer some thoughts on what you would recommend the president or the commander in chief should do, we'd welcome that as well.
Sure, happy to, Ned, and thanks for having me. It's good to be with you in this group. Look, as you know all too well, by the time an issue like this gets to the president's desk, regardless of what president is, chances are it's really hard and there aren't good options. And that is certainly the case here for some of the reasons Holly laid out. I would start by saying it seems to me that this president has made his own task a little bit harder with his own approach over the last couple of weeks, coming out 2 weeks ago and very clearly saying that if Iran shoots at and kills protesters, that the United States would rescue them. And then just this week coming forward again and calling on them to take the institutions and keep protesting, and that help is on the way. Now, you can make a case for that if there is careful thought that went behind these messages, and not quite sure there was, but the case for it would be you're doing this to deter the regime against using force, and you're trying to show solidarity and support for the people. But it sure seems to be the case that the former didn't work. The threat to the regime, we will rescue the people and stop you if you act. Well, they sure did act. And, as Ollie said, we don't know exactly the numbers yet, but they used violent force and the U.S. has yet to respond. And to the degree that this actually inspired the people to rise up and try to take the institutions, then there's a bit of U.S. responsibility for urging them on. It feels a little bit like George H.W. Bush in 1991 telling the Iraqi people to take things in their own hands. So I wanted to say that, but we are where we are, and your question is, what do you advise a president, and what are the options? Again, I think the options are quite narrow now, especially having gone out there as President Trump did and called on the people to rise up. Either he backs down, and you heard him say the other day the killing has stopped, and so there's a potential off ramp there, but that comes at a certain cost, especially in terms of the credibility of his word. I remember after Venezuela, the White House was so clear in saying this is a president, if he says something, he acts. So it's A, the credibility, and B, you're also then leaving the regime in place, this regime that was already horrific, but then has exercised violence and cracked down on people in recent weeks. Or you go ahead and use force, which was the other option. But that raises the real question of, what are you trying to accomplish with that force, and what would it accomplish if you did? And I would say right now, both of those options are still on the table. The United States is deploying more force to the region. One of the reasons apparently the president didn't intervene is that he wasn't comfortable with the U.S. force posture, because if you attack Iran, they could respond. And if we don't have enough interceptors and air defense in the region, we could be vulnerable and our allies could be vulnerable. So that option is still on the table. My own view, because you asked about that as well, is I am deeply skeptical of that latter option, fully cognizant of the downsides of not acting, which leaves this horrible regime in place, and there's the credibility thing that the president piled on. But I have yet to understand what U.S. military force would accomplish were we to use it in Iran. I don't think a limited strike would have any impact on the regime's hold on power. Ultimately, I suppose if you used enough U.S. military force, you could take down the regime. But then that raises the question of what you would expect to happen then. I think there hasn't been enough thought given to that scenario for all of those clamoring for the U.S. to use force and get rid of this horrible regime. And let's be clear, it would be good if this regime were gone. It's not clear to me what would follow, and there would be the risk not only of a military response by Iran and escalation, but even more of even greater concern, breakdown in Iran and violence and chaos. And I fear that those who would come out on top of that are not the peaceful protesters and Democrats we would want to see, but the people with arms. I mean, as you know, Ned, I wrote a whole book about regime change in the Middle East and the broader Middle East, and whether it's Afghanistan or Iraq or Libya or Syria, there is not a case where outside intervention led to a smooth democratic transition. There are a lot of cases where it led to violence and domestic unrest.
Phil, thanks for that sobering take. We're going to come back to that, I'm sure. One of the great things about this panel is that we have four very, very smart people on this issue who sometimes come at this issue from different perspectives and have some constructive disagreements. And so with that, Mike, I want to sort of ask you a variation of the same question. I want to ask you to either agree with the options that Phil put on the table, if you think there are options that he didn't mention that he should have mentioned, and then would love to hear your thoughts on where this president should come down in terms of any U.S. role in what is set to unfold in Iran in the coming days and weeks.
Sure. Well, thank you, Ned. It's great to be on this panel with Lina and Phil and Holly, and with you, of course. Look, I think first and foremost, I would go back to what Holly was talking about, because we need to remember this is not a story about the United States. It seems like every foreign policy issue right now seems as though it's about the United States because we're very loud and we're very active at the moment. But this is really about the Iranian people. And it's just the continuation of what I think has been a long-running display of the Iranian people's real disillusionment and dissatisfaction with their regime. I actually think that what we're seeing in Iran is very similar to what we have been seeing in Saudi Arabia, except you have a very different kind of government on top of those two populations. In Saudi Arabia, a government which is looking to harness the sort of interest of their younger population and change In Iran, a government which is trying to stifle that and repress it. And so I think from a U.S. perspective, or frankly from the perspective of, the West or the international community, if you will, in general, the first thing to do is to take, sort of advice from Hippocrates and first do no harm. Don't do anything that could interfere with the Iranian population's sort of ability to affect change in their own country. So I would say, what I heard from President Trump and Vice President Vance that I found most concerning was not the threat of strikes, and I'll get back to that in a moment. It was that, in the midst of these protests, there was clearly a sort of back channel messaging going on between the Iranian regime and the White House about negotiations. Now, we can agree or disagree about US-Iran negotiations, nuclear talks, and so forth, but I think to do that in the midst of these protests would be the wrong move. To suggest, well, you may not like the regime, but we're going to go sit down in Geneva with them or something like that would send exactly the wrong message. There are limited tools, as Phil said, for the U.S. to sort of try to put our thumb on the scale and affect the outcome of this type of situation. And that's been incredibly frustrating to one administration after another. I mean, certainly to President Obama with the Green Movement, we saw that. And then to subsequent presidents with other protests, because this story of protest has been an ongoing one. People talk about sanctions, about seizing oil, for example, from the Iranian regime, as we did to Venezuela. I think that may be worthwhile to do as a means of pressure on the regime. Will it bring this situation to a head or change the outcome of the protest? That I think is a little harder to see, in the sense that if the regime really believes it's fighting for its survival, presumably it's willing to sacrifice quite a bit economically for the sake of doing that. Would military strikes make a difference, as President Trump had suggested? Again, it's hard to say, in part because we've never really had that kind of external intervention in an Iranian protest movement in, recent memory, at least. You could make the argument that if the regime felt as though it was going to pay a sort of heavy price militarily for sending out the security forces, if, for example, you had American strikes against command and control infrastructure for the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard Corps, or the Basij, who are the paramilitary forces in Iran. Maybe there'd be an element of deterrence there. But I do think that any president, when they're considering such an option, is going to consider steps, or should consider steps 2 and 3. What happens if, for example, you have civilian casualties in such strikes? Could that be counterproductive? What happens if the Iranian regime chooses to retaliate against American forces in the region? Are you postured to deal with that? It seems pretty clear that President Trump decided the answer to those questions was no. And he did this not just on the basis of military advice, presumably, but also we have seen in reporting that he heard from American partners in the region, Israel and others, that they didn't want to see this narrative. And so what was interesting to me and actually kind of disappointing in a way about this dynamic was, we have crossed the Rubicon of direct strikes on Iran. And I do think it's worth considering, at least, sort of around the table in the White House Situation Room, whether strikes could be effective in this case. But we fell back very quickly on an old narrative, right, which is that any strike on Iran is going to spark a regional war. To me, that was never true. I think we saw in June that it wasn't true then, at least. And I think it's sort of the wrong reason not to use military force in this case. There may be other valid reasons, but I think this idea that somehow Iran is this big power that can spark a regional conflagration is just not right, especially at this stage. And I think that there's as Phil said here, he and I agree, a real downside to President Trump having floated this in a way that may have spurred protesters to come out in greater numbers and then back off afterwards, only afterwards sort of actually fully weighing the decision and considering the decision and saying, you know what, no, now it's not something we're prepared to do for all the reasons that we could have foreseen actually before issuing the threat. I think that's, in a way, the worst case scenario, is to make that kind of military threat and then so publicly back away from it. I think, though, that leaves a space where there are some other options which we should be engaging in. Hopefully we are engaging in behind the scenes, and that's actual support to the protesters. Can we, for example, help them to overcome the blockage of the internet using communications tools, using technology? Can we help them through even financial means? Can we sort of ensure that, for example, the diaspora can continue sending funds to protesters, especially those who are out of work or maybe not able to get to their jobs because of what's going on in the country? What are the things that we can do to actually directly support the protesters? We've sort of hamstrung ourselves in the past by worrying that this would somehow discredit the Iranian protesters, but I think the question is discredit them in the eyes of who? The regime already calls them, sort of agents of the West. This is a sort of mass movement where I think you have a good portion of the populace that hates the regime. And I think this idea of discrediting the protesters through help from overseas is really one of these things that we just use to as an excuse for inaction for the most part. So I think there are options there. I think none of them are decisive, though, probably. The decisive action lies in the hands of the Iranian people, not in the hands of the United States or any other country overseas.
Very helpful, and we're going to come back to the options before the United States, but certainly take your point that ultimately the decisive actor here is going to be the Iranian people. But I do, before we come back to the role of the United States, I do want to turn to you, Lina, to hear your thoughts on the regional dynamics of all of this. You recently wrote in Time magazine, quote, "The regime, it seems, may be taking its last breaths and has no one to turn to." And it's that last clause that I want to ask you about. I'm hoping you can speak to the regional dynamics really in two directions. First, if you could expound on that dynamic when it comes to Iran's traditional allies, some of whom, as you alluded to, are no longer there for Iran, and what that means for regime stability and longevity. And then second, if you could speak to how America's partners, namely the Saudis, the Qataris, the Emiratis, see this. There's been some reporting that these three partners are not quite on the same page when it comes to the thinking behind U.S. Intervention, and would love to hear your thoughts on that. Lina, I think you're on mute.
Yes.
Great.
Thank you very much. What I wrote about in Time magazine was in the aftermath of the war in June of 2025, and the argument still holds. And I would say the Iranian regime is even weaker now than it was when I wrote that piece a few months ago. There is an unprecedented opportunity, actually, for this regime to fall. And I am predicting that the regime will eventually collapse, because there is no way for a regime that has not changed its playbook to survive when the circumstances around it have shifted radically. So we're seeing this playbook at play, unfortunately, through the extreme violence that the Iranian regime is inflicting on the Iranian people. This is the Iranian regime's way of dealing with dissent, and to expect it to do something different would just be fantasy. And so for me, whatever President Trump has been saying in public about the regime's engagement in violence, and any hint that things may have stopped, should be taken as more of a clever move, I would say, by the president, rather than taken to mean that we can expect this regime to actually stop being violent to the Iranian people. We saw this at play in Syria. When the uprising in Syria happened, it was Iran that advised Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria at the time, to crack down with violence, just as Iran had done in 2009 when it cracked down on the Green Movement. And so we now look at a very different Iran from what had existed in 2011 or even just 3 years ago, before October 7, 2023. The Iran that we have today is ruled by a regime that has no outside friends. Russia and China, for example, after Israel attacked Iran's air defense system, did not replenish this system. They have not jumped to Iran's rescue economically. And so there is no other country out there that is going to help Iran militarily. When it comes to Iran's allies in the shape of its proxies, Iran likes to call them the axis of resistance. This is just a propaganda kind of title. This is a group of militias like Hezbollah in Lebanon and other militias that Iran had used to extend its influence in the region. You look at them and you realize that they are all very, very weak right now and unable to really rally to Iran's rescue. Even if it orders them to act, they will not be very effective. So Iran is really quite isolated when it comes to its own so-called allies and partners. And this makes it very vulnerable. Now, when it comes to, you asked about regional actors, we have seen what happened with Qatar, with both Israel and Iran attacking Qatari territory. And the last thing that Qatar wants, and it's the same for other Arab Gulf countries, the last thing they want is to be caught in the crossfire. So their approach has been to distance themselves from what is going on right now and publicly issue messages that emphasize that they do not want to be involved in any military action against Iran and that their preferred way is diplomacy. They do not want to become a target. And it makes sense because they are right there in the vicinity of Iran geographically. But I think for Israel, a crucial thing is because of this weakness of the Iranian regime now, there is an unprecedented opportunity for Israel to do something decisive about this threat that Iran poses. Because I think after the horrific October 7 attack, Israel will no longer put up with having this Iranian threat continue. And so I think the story right now has reached a bit of a pause, but we will see, I think, a continuation, and Iran will not be able to recover. And so for me, we should not focus so much on what we are hearing in the public domain in terms of messaging. What we should really be waiting for is to see the next phase of kinetic activity, which alone is not going to bring down the Iranian regime. But I think the combination of the change in the domestic scene, this kinetic activity, that is the military activity that I expect will eventually happen, and the economic suffocation of Iran with the lack of external support, lead us to, a very different Middle East further down the line.
Lina, thanks for that. And I want to follow up on that because you've offered an assessment that we're likely to see a decisive conclusion to this regime in the coming period, however long that is. I caught an interview that former Secretary of State Tony Blinken gave a couple days ago, and he sort of quipped that the only thing we know for sure is that the Iranian regime will survive until it doesn't. And so I'm curious. And you went into this a little bit, Lina, but why do we think 2026 is different from 2009, 2017, 2022, when it looked like the regime might have been on the brink at those times? Part of it, Lina, you just described as sort of the regional dynamics. It's the aftermath of the 12-day war. It's the aftermath of the skirmishes in 2024. It's the aftermath of the fall of the Assad regime. But curious if the panelists think that there are dynamics within this protest movement that are categorically different from what we've seen in previous uprisings.
I'll jump in and answer that
Please.
question. So Ned, you laid it out really well, and Lina, as adding to what she said earlier, I really think that it is that, I would say, post-October 7th world dynamics with the proxies, the downfall of Bashar al-Assad, its top regional ally, and of course, the aftermath of the 12-day war that has really left the regime in a state of paralysis. They've resorted to their own old strategy or playbook, and we've seen this in reports that they're rebuilding their ballistic missiles program, that they're still continuing to fund their proxies. And it signals to me that they haven't really understood the dynamics of what's at hand. And just looking at some of the commentary from Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, and even Iranian officials, they're very vocally pushing back against Trump. And this is a president that doesn't take well to insults. And if anything, that would raise his ire and want to do something. And if we remember during the 12-day war, when there was a ceasefire, there was a tweet that the president, or was actually on Truth Social, that he said, "You're lucky I didn't let them kill you," when after the supreme leader had declared victory. It apparently had really upset President Trump. So I think for me, when I see that, it seems that they don't understand the dynamics of the region have changed. And then looking at domestically, as I noted earlier, they've had this issue of systemic mismanagement, corruption, and repression for years. Iranians have been taking the streets in anti-regime protests since December 2017, 2018. And then we had Bloody November 2019, which was also under an internet shutdown that led to a massacre of 1,500 protesters, according to Reuters. And then, of course, famously, the 2022 Woman Life Freedom Uprising. And here we are again. And so they haven't addressed those issues. There's Iranians that are struggling to feed their families. They have blackouts in an oil and gas-rich country. And then more importantly, just the other month, there was all these reports about Tehran entering day zero where it would possibly run out of water. So they've created an environment for their people where they're not addressing their needs. And that's what we're seeing right now. You noted Saudi Arabia. I just went there for the first time in December, and that's what really stood out to me, is that they're building a future for their youth, for their people. And the Islamic Republic is doing the complete opposite. Iranians want change in their country. They want to be part of the international community. They want to live normal lives. And that's why they're out there.
Then maybe I can. So I
Please.
agree with the argument that this time is different. The question is it different enough to bring about a change? It's different for the reasons given. Strategically, Iran is objectively weaker than it was when it faced all the previous protests. It's lost its proxies in regional countries. A lot of the leaders have been killed, including in the 12-day war over the summer. Economically, it's even weaker than before after decades of economic mismanagement and international sanctions leading to the water crises and the issues Holly just addressed. You have a new generation of Iranians, which is probably even more fed up with this corrupt, stagnant leadership than previous ones. And they see some of their neighbors entering modernity and having the things that they want and deserve too. The supreme leader is, 86 years old? So that's an opportunity for this to be different too, because we're really on the verge of a leadership transition, which is sometimes the trigger for regime changes. And you have particularly intense US policy and an administration even more intense. So you put all that together, and there's reason to believe that maybe this set of protests is going to be different with a different result. The problem is, and so I agree with the assessment that in the long run, this regime is doomed. We just don't know how long that long run is, and it's usually longer than you think. You look at other situations, most regimes hold on because they have power and they're determined to hold on and everything is at stake. And usually they're willing to use violence to hold on and their opponents aren't. And unfortunately, I think that is the case in this Iran today. I often point out, Mubarak's Egypt was also unsustainable in the long run. And if you predicted that one day it would fall, you were right, but you had to be wrong 29 years in a row before you were right. I think the same is true about Iran. This regime is doomed, and ultimately the people will replace it. But it usually takes longer than you would like. And I fear that the situation, as weak as they are right now, they still have the guns and the determination to hold on to power, as they showed us so tragically over the past week.
Can I just add something on that? I heard similar arguments about the Assad regime, similar arguments about the strength of Hezbollah. Even I personally thought that Hezbollah would put up a much stronger fight against Israel, for example, with all its arsenal, being the most heavily armed militia in the whole world. It didn't stand a chance. And so I think, while I agree with you that the timeline is unknown, and I don't have a particular, degree of certainty when it comes to the timeline. I have, an expected timeline, but I can't, tell you for sure that's going to happen. I would say we should also recognize that sometimes when it comes to Iran, there has been over the years a bit of an inflation, not just an inflation, but overinflation of Iran's capacity to survive. And that in itself has acted as a bit of a deterrent, especially in Washington, regarding changing the status quo of Iran's influence. And I would say this was definitely seen during the administrations of Barack Obama and Joe Biden. There was this assumption that this regime will basically always be there, so would rather craft policy on that basis rather than looking for opportunities to change the status quo. And here I particularly point to the issue of the nuclear enrichment file, where there was so much focus on that issue and not enough focus at all on the ballistic missiles program or on Iran's destabilizing proxies. And that was partly because there was this assumption that this regime is there to stay. So I would say that thinking in Washington has now shifted today in this administration of Donald Trump. And that is a major factor. And again, I mentioned the Israel factor. After October 7, Israel's own capacity for tolerance of a threat nearby has also shifted completely. And I'm monitoring with my colleagues. I work for a decision intelligence company called Extract, and we're monitoring all kinds of disinformation online. And one of the interesting things that we're seeing is that there's quite a bit of propaganda right now by some of the proxies for Iran. And I remember seeing similar things during the Israel-Hezbollah war. If you looked at the communication, you thought, wow, Hezbollah is going to be so powerful, it's going to, cause a lot of damage in Israel. But the reality was very different. So again, the circumstances today, I think, especially in Washington, I would say are very different.
Let me just say one thing, and I'm sure Mike's keen to get in, but all fair points. I was just going to say, because you brought up Assad, it's a good example. Those who said Assad's days were numbered turned out to be right. I heard his days were numbered when I started doing the White House Middle East job in 2013, and that was the view then. So, ultimately, it was right. It was just 12 years later that it turned out to be right, and it was right when you had this armed militia backed by Turkey of battle-hardened former terrorists who overthrew the regime. So again, I agree with you. Ultimately, this regime is unpopular. The people are against it. The strategic situation is changing, and it probably will ultimately be pushed aside. But again, usually the bet is that it takes longer than we think or would like.
No, I think a lot of what can be said has been said. I think the one thing that Phil is forgetting is that we're not in government anymore, so we don't need to be dull and boring. So I think that my view is this is probably the regime's last year. I think that we have seen so many things going against Iran in the last several years. I mean, it's been economically crippled by sanctions, by mismanagement of the government. We've seen these protests over and over again, so that domestic legitimacy has been gone. And the change we have seen in the last 6 months or so is that the big barrier, that sort of stopped Israel, United States, other states from sort of taking action against Iran, that fear of the kind of wider conflict, the fear of Iran's defenses, is essentially gone. That fear is, I think, mostly broken. I think it has been used in our current context as a reason not to actually follow through on President Trump's threats. But I do think we will see, as somebody else I think has already said, another significant round of strikes by Israel against Iran, against its ballistic missile program. I think the Israelis now see that Iran is conventionally weaker, perhaps, than they understood. It doesn't have the proxy capabilities to retaliate against Israel in the way that it did before the 12-day war last year. And so I think that leaves this regime in a strategic crisis that will be very difficult for the regime to resolve, other than either some kind of very significant change. And that might not be democratic change, let's bear in mind. It might be a, sort of a Young Turks type of takeover of the regime, or frankly, some sort of dash for a nuclear weapon or other very significant sort of strategic game changer, which we do need to be watching out for. But I think when you couple that with the fact that by all accounts, the supreme leader is, if not sort of at death's door, in very poor health, and even before this crisis, was not really fully at the wheel, which is problematic in a sort of autocratic regime characterized by one man rule. And to me, we're sort of reaching the end of the road here. And because I'm an analyst at a think tank, I'm happy to say this is the last year.
Well, this is being recorded and live streamed, so we'll review this down the road. I want to start to transition to student questions and questions from fellows and faculty as well at Harvard. Just a reminder, you can put your questions in the Q&A box, and please specify your affiliation if you wish. Mike, I want to pick up on what you said about sort of a young Turks-esque transition, because we've talked about will or won't the regime fall, will the supreme leader or won't the supreme leader be there? Well, let's just assume the supreme leader isn't there. Who is likely to fill the vacuum? And I think there's an argument out there that says, those wishing for the supreme leader to leave the scene are just wishing for the IRGC to take his place. There are those who say that now is the moment for Reza Pahlavi, and this is the moment for the son of the Shah. I'm curious what this group thinks about, who is primed to take that place, and then especially when it comes to Reza Pahlavi, whether there is actually organic support in Iran for him to return, or whether this is more wishful thinking on the part of his support base in the diaspora.
Well, maybe I'll just say something at the outset. I'm sure
Yeah.
everybody has thoughts on this. I think we do have examples of this kind of situation from the not so distant history. Obviously, we have Venezuela right now, where the Trump administration made this determination, controversially perhaps, that the sort of regime of Maduro was in the best position to actually govern the country after his, sort of being spirited away to New York, rather than the opposition. We have the example of Egypt that Phil referenced earlier, where after a period of, sort of Muslim Brotherhood rule, the army took over. And I think most of us would have said prior to the so-called Arab Spring in 2011 that the army was the entity that was most powerful, most sort of economically capable of ruling the country and taking power. And so I think that, most analysts of Iran who look at the situation now say that it is, in fact, the security services, the IRGC, because of its preponderant role in both security and the economy, which seems best positioned to run the country if there were a leadership change. I think there are two complications with that, though, for which I really don't have an answer, and maybe Holly has a better sense than I do. Number one, the IRGC is not monolithic. So you say the IRGC, that's not a person. That's a vast organization with different factions and competing powerful individuals. And I'm not sure we even know exactly who we're talking about when we say the IRGC. You will hear that, especially in the wake of the 12-Day War, that there was a lot of discontent amongst younger sort of, I don't know if you could call it a regime new guard in a sense, at least younger officers at the performance of their superiors, at the performance of the regime in the face of that conflict. I think the other thing we don't know is if a person or a group of people were to try to take power, how would they do that? What would they see as the sort of support they needed? Would they reach out internationally? Would they try to harness this domestic protest movement we're seeing? Would they, in a sort of populist sense? And so it's not such a clear binary between, we have democracy over here, we have the military over there, and so forth. I think what history shows us is that, you'll end up having lots of different ingredients, lots of different factions, and probably we'll see sort of shifting coalitions as there's a jockeying for power. And frankly, you'll see countries on the outside, the United States, China, the region, kind of reaching in and trying to see who they can do business with, and is this new regime is something that they can work with. We saw that, by the way, it may seem ludicrous now, in 1979. Remember, when the Islamic Revolution happened, the Carter administration felt that they could continue having good relations with Iran after that happened. Of course, they were completely wrong, but they at least tried. And I think we would sort of see the United States and others try to reach out to a new government in Iran, almost regardless of what it looked like?
As a member of the diaspora and someone that spent their formative years in Iran, I feel like I'm best to answer your second part of your question,
Please.
Ned. I think it's been extraordinary to watch Iranian protesters chant pro-Pahlavi chants in the past couple weeks before the internet shut down. I've heard everything from "Long live the Shah" to "This is the last battle, Pahlavi will return," and "Reza Shah, may your soul be blessed," in reference to the founder of the Pahlavi dynasty. Of course, this wasn't all the protesters. I had documented over a dozen type of chants. But it's extraordinary because today, exactly 47 years ago, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi got on a flight because of protests against him. And so these chants have been antithetical to the Islamic Republic. And they've been happening for a host of reasons. Some of it is because it's the direct opposite of the Islamic Republic. It's because some see that Reza Pahlavi could be a transitional leader. He's offered himself that. And because there's an institutional legacy and real calls that back him, I think that that's become an increasing prospect. I've heard from some Iranians inside that they're like, if not him, who? That being said, there's plenty of Nelson Mandelas inside Iran, and many of them are in prison. There are two Nobel Peace Prize winners. Both of them are women. One's in exile, Shirin Ebadi. The other is Nargis Mohammadi, who's currently in prison. And for a very long time, we've heard from activists inside the country calling for a constitutional assembly, for a referendum, and most recently, 17 activists, including Mohammadi, calling for a transition in recent weeks. So, I mean, there are options. And I think we should remember we did technically have somebody take over the country 47 years ago who came from abroad and also through cassette tapes. Today, social media and the internet are the new cassette tapes. So just keeping an open mind there. How that would happen is a very different conversation, but I think we should be open that there is history behind some of this.
Maybe then I'll just add,
Please.
it seems to me the essential question, and a very much open question, as this discussion underscores, we really don't know. I made a reference earlier to the guys with guns, that like if you had to bet and there's a security vacuum, you have security forces. Now, as Mike said, they may not be unified, but they would have the upper hand unless you could get in a situation, which is not unprecedented in history, and Nelson Mandela was mentioned, that the opposition could somehow be organized behind some figure who would lead it and somehow have more power than whatever factions with guns. Now, I don't know if that's probably anything is possible. There's a lot of skepticism. Absurd that the Shah's son could be the leader of Iran. I would remind you that the current president of the Philippines, last name is Marcos, the son of the very dictator who was massively chased out by people power. So anything is possible, including, scarily enough, like none of the above. And that's, of course, the other risk of creating a security vacuum, is that no one's in charge. Iran is a big, diverse place with different ethnic groups and different factions and different ideologies. And that's the other concern you have to have when you get rid of a system like this. That nobody is in charge. I mean, you saw that in Iraq and elsewhere, and it's a sort of violent free-for-all. The last thing I would add, because I also don't exclude it, you mentioned the supreme leader, so none of us know when there might be a political revolution in Iran. It is safe to bet, without going on a limb like Mike with a specific timetable, the supreme leader is not going to be around. I don't know if it's 2026, but it's not going to be much longer than that. And you could imagine that being a transition point, possibly, at a minimum, to a regime that would be less revolutionary, less ideological, less sectarian than it has been for decades. And I mean, taking that thought further, somebody mentioned the Venezuela precedent. That could be on their minds as well. That the Trump administration has already shown we're willing to do deals with people. Honestly, we don't care if they're still kind of repressive. That's certainly the case in Venezuela. It's the Maduro regime. But if they're willing to work with us on things we care about, whether it's narcotics or oil or investments, then we can do business. And I actually think this regime missed an opportunity. It had plenty of opportunities to do deals. I think the Trump administration was ready to do a nuclear deal, or even, as Lina suggested, a ballistic missile deal, a regional deal that could have led to them staying in power, exporting oil, frankly, getting an economic lifeline. But for whatever reason, first and foremost, because the supreme leader is ideological and anti-American and stubborn and wouldn't do it, they missed that opportunity. As they look around the world, it's not crazy for me to think that it would come back. I completely agree to Mike that it'd be unseemly to be talking of negotiations with these guys while they're massacring Iranians. But if this settles into something different, and especially if the supreme leader is gone, I wouldn't exclude some, whether it's IRGC or some military faction, to be interested in a deal with the United States.
I just want to piggyback on the point that Phil made about Venezuela. Before the communication shutdowns, there was a real worry amongst Iranians on the streets that there would be a Venezuela-like deal, that they would effectively, maybe there was a sacrificial lamb like the supreme leader, and then somebody with a more friendlier face of the regime would be like, okay, we'll hand over the nuclear program or the ballistic missiles program, whatever. And then the Trump administration would go for it and effectively throw all these Iranians that are out on the streets risking their lives under the bus. And so that was a real concern. And of course, they were under a communications shutdown watching this play out on diaspora satellite dish when the president was posting that he might talk with these guys and also in interviews. And so I can't imagine what they were feeling seeing that play out, and certainly thinking again about that Venezuela scenario. So it is a real worry of people inside the country.
I want to turn to one of the questions from Leah Kajavi, who is an ALI fellow at Harvard. Leah actually posed a question we were discussing in the green room before we started. It was about some recent reporting by CNN and other sources in the past 24 hours that the regime has actually outsourced some of its brutality to, as the reporting goes, 5,000 Iraqi mercenaries to effect the execution of demonstrators. And Leah asked whether this could mean that the Basij's militias are starting to put their arms down and cease the killing of their fellow Iranians. I know there's been some skepticism of this reporting, but wanted to open up to responses on that.
Yeah, I can tell you again, my colleagues and I have been tracking all kinds of disinformation online, and there is no indication right now that there is any credibility to this kind of scenario of thousands of Iraqi militia fighters who are pro-Iran entering Iran to help the regime. However, if such a scenario does happen, then this means that the capacity of the Iranian forces is very weak. Because think about it, in Syria, when the revolution happened in 2011, and when the Assad regime felt that it was not able to control the revolution on its own, that's when we saw the active participation on the ground by Hezbollah and other Iran-backed actors. And so this kind of scenario would be an indication of weakness, further weakness of the Iranian regime itself. But I personally think that for a lot of these Iranian proxies, the priority right now is their own survival. And a lot of them are, yes, backed by Iran, but at the same time are mindful of the domestic situation in which they are operating. And so there's, a number of factors that have to be taken into consideration when you assess whether a scenario like that is realistic or not. And when it comes to Iraq, the domestic situation that is very important right now is the formation of a new government after the recent Iraqi elections. And so again, it would not, I would say, work in a lot of these militias' favor to engage in such a way in the Iranian scenario.
I'll just say one more thing about this, Ned, which is I don't know if the reports are true or not, but we actually have seen this, I would say, several times in the past where, the IRGC uses its proxy network, Iraqi Shia militias in Syria, Hezbollah, and so forth. And they sort of move them around. So we've seen Hezbollah active in Iraq. We have seen Iraqi Shia militias active in Iran in past situations of domestic unrest. It wouldn't necessarily be unusual, and I'd personally avoid reading too much into it, even if we could establish that this were true. It's, I think, just the way that the IRGC operates to a great extent.
I want to paraphrase a question that a number of people have asked in the chat, and it is basically the nature of these protests. Some have asked whether, as was their perception in 2009, that some of those protests were the results of elites jockeying within the Iranian system. Some have asked how much of the protests are being instigated by external forces, whether that's the United States, Israel, others. I'm curious. It seems like this group, what we've heard from Holly and others, the consensus seems to be that this is organic. It is widespread. It is a mass organic protest movement. But Holly or others, anything you want to add to this variation of question?
Yeah, I think I've heard a lot. It's been really disappointing to see. I've seen some media outlets, some academics make this comment that this is an Israel-US back uprising, that maybe these people are being paid by Western countries to go out in the streets. And I think that's insulting, and it denies the Iranian people agency, who have been out on the streets for years now in cyclical protests. And if they had their way, they would have ousted the Islamic Republic years ago. And so I think, and I say this as someone that has met some of those former protesters who have had to flee the country in Europe, in the United States. In the most recent uprising in 2022, there were protesters that were systemically blinded in the eye. Apparently, that's happening right now. I've met some of these kids. They're gym trainers, they're students, they're ordinary Iranians just asking for freedom. And so I think it's really unfair to put them in a box because they don't like what they're seeing and it doesn't fit their narrative of what's happening in Iran. And so I really want to emphasize on that. Going back to the Green Movement, so I think the dynamics are a bit different. In 2009, there was a sham election between President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and Mir Hossein Mousavi. And Iranians started taking the streets, demanding for their votes to be recalled. And then it became so much more. It evolved into a call for change. Of course, that was unsuccessful at the time, but within the leadership, there were dynamics at play because guess what? Mir Hossein Mousavi and the other presidential candidate, Mehdi Karoubi, were put under house arrest since 2011. And it's those characters, specifically Mousavi and his wife Zahra Ranavard, who have been calling for a referendum in Iran for years and have been pushing back against the Islamic Republic. And it was Ahmadinejad that was given another term. So there was some dynamics at play at the time.
Just very quickly, one final question with the remaining 2 minutes we have left. We've talked about the internal dynamics. We've talked about the regional dynamics. We have a question from one of our affiliates about what this means for China and China's role in the Middle East, whether Iran under this regime is to continue or whether it falls, what that means for the ability of Beijing to have influence in the Middle East.
I suppose I could tackle this one briefly, Ned. I think it's bad for China, frankly, what's happening in Iran now. Strictly because, look, China is Iran's most important external partner. The reverse is not true. Iran is not China's most important external partner by any means, but China, I think, does see Iran as a sort of strategic asset in the Middle East. It has other relationships in the Middle East which are more significant economically, more valuable from the point of view of, say, infrastructure investment, critical minerals, oil, and things like that. But Iran is the only country along this Persian Gulf littoral which is not a partner of the United States, not a key security partner of the United States. And so therefore, I mean, Iran offers China something that those countries can't, which if you had a sort of period of heightened tensions between the U.S. and China, or even conflict between the U.S. and China, Iran is therefore becomes quite important, especially in the energy picture, as well as maybe as a kind of as a partner for causing trouble for the United States in this sort of very sensitive maritime choke point of the Strait of Hormuz. I think what China does not want to see is it does not want to see an Iran which suddenly becomes either friendly to the United States, whether that's through a nuclear deal or through a regime change, nor I think does it want to see Iran fall into utter chaos, which would potentially cause other problems for China beyond the ones that I just mentioned. So I think as long as I think we have to look at it in sort of a measured way. I mean, China's main concerns are going to be in its own neighborhood in Asia, but I think China will look at this unrest, at the weakness of the regime, especially at the weakness of the regime in the face of American and Israeli attacks, as strategically not a good thing for it, especially coming at the same time as Venezuela, again, maybe not a top tier strategic interest for China, but when you start putting them together, not a great sort of confluence of events overall for Beijing.
Excellent. Well, we have somehow exhausted our hour. I'm sure we could have gone on for at least another hour, given all that has unfolded and what more is to come, I'm sure. But as the situation continues to evolve, we at the Kennedy School and the Institute of Politics, we're going to remain closely engaged in monitoring these developments and trying our best to foster informed dialogue on this critical issue. I really want to thank our panelists today for such an informed, constructive, enlightening conversation. Holly, Mike, Lina, and Phil. I want to thank our co-sponsors at the Belfer Center. And most of all, I want to thank you all for tuning in. So we really look forward to continuing this conversation. And we look forward to the start of the spring semester in just a few days here. Thank you all. I hope you all have a nice weekend. And I'm sure we'll be seeing you soon.